Good evening,
Good
and
evening.
welcome to Shedley Faith. Tonight, I'm speaking to my good friend from Hope Community Church, Joe Crowe, and we're going to be talking about who is Jesus and really sort of get into the essence and the bottom of who the man is and who he is in God and how he fits into our lives and how we fit into his. Um, Thanks for doing this, mate. It's really appreciated. Um, let's go to the start of the story then. Who is Jesus?
Go on then. Okay, so uh, yeah, thanks for having me as well. By the way, Jack, I'm really pleased to be here, mate. Yeah. So, who is Jesus? You probably get a lot of answers to that, couldn't you? In all honesty, who I would say he is he's the Son of God, and that's quite a big claim to make. That's a claim he made about himself. It's a title, it's a relational kind of statement. If he's the Son of God, then God is a father, because obviously you need the parent and sort of child thing. So you've got the father relationship to the son. I'd say he's the savior as well. And I know he saved me, and he saved me from a lot of stuff as well. Um, he's our friend. He's our um, is there a better word than advocate? Like he he has our side, if that makes sense. Yeah, he cares for us. He looks after us in that sense. So yeah. So God, before I give any more statements on it, that's where I'll start, mate. That's where I'll start. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's all these things,
Mm.
but, and that I guess is a little bit more to comprehend and a little bit more difficult to comprehend for some people. Who is he in a human's perspective? Is
Yeah,
he
yeah,
100% human? Is he God? Is he what is he?
yeah. So Jesus is a person. So he's a human being, just the same as you or me. So I can say, well, anyone can say, any Christian can say that Jesus is 100% human. He's a man. You know, he's a human. At the same time, he's 100% God. Now that immediately is just like, what? I can't quite, that doesn't make sense. Are you sure it's not 50-50? Are you sure it's not 60-40 or whatever? But the Bible's very clear on him that he is fully man, fully God. So one person, Jesus, and he's got his human nature and his divine nature. All man, all God, fully man, fully God is the proper way of describing it. And it is kind of mind blowing. We know he's a man because obviously you can read things in the Bible. You'll read of him like, what's one of the stories? You'll know it, Jack, where they're crossing over. Is it the Sea of Galilee in the boat? And he has a nap. He needs to rest. He needs to eat. He needs to sleep. And people, that's what we do, right? If you're a
Mhm.
human, you need to rest. You need to sleep. Then at the same time, he can read the thoughts of people. At the same time, he can, you know, open the eyes of the blind. At the same time, he can make people who have been, some people who have been kind of paralyzed for life, he makes them get up and walk. So you see these two things throughout the whole life. He's a man. He's 100% man. He's 100% God. He's fully man, fully God. So it's kind of really difficult to get your head around. And it's eventually I've kind of you realize after a while that you won't ever fully understand that kind of mystery, but you know it's true because this is what he says about himself. Yeah.
So we know that now he's fully a man, but he wasn't always fully man, was he?
Yeah,
He,
yeah.
he,
So
he was born. He
yeah. So he's got a birth, same as you and I. Yeah. So the way that John is, some of your listeners might know that there's like four main gospels, as we call them in the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, basically. John and all of them generally were, amongst his close followers. John was a very, close follower of Jesus. He's probably Jesus's youngest disciple. So again, people will probably have heard of things like the 12 disciples and stuff like that. John was one of them, and he was probably, we think, the youngest of those disciples. So he was probably, I don't know, in his teens or 20s even at the time. Some of the other guys were a bit older. So anyway, so John writes his gospel, which is probably, we think, so his book, he writes his book about the life of Jesus, and we think that was probably the last one that was written. And yeah, he says at the start of it, and I've got it here in front of me, so where is it? After he talks about, obviously, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So this is him talking about Jesus. So that word where he says Word, the Word was with God, the Word was God. He's describing to us who Jesus was, before. And then you're quite right, he has a birth, and it says that, where is it here? And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. So you're quite right that the way to describe it is that the Son of God, who has always existed, always was there. There was never a time he wasn't. He took on a human nature, so he didn't stop being God. He didn't become a mix of two things, he's still God, still, and then adds to that, a human nature as well. Yeah. So again, trying to wrap your mind around this from a how does that work perspective is really, really quite difficult. But listen to what John says there when he talks about it, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory like the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So, trying to comprehend it is quite tricky, but when you see it, that's when it suddenly comes alive to you, and you're like, wow. And that's what John talks about there. We're seeing his glory. I've walked with this man for many years, is what John's saying here, and I have seen his glory. I see Jesus. I see this man in front of me. Yeah. At the same time, I'm seeing God. Yeah. So yeah.
So you'd think if he was the Son of God and the Son of royalty, he'd be born into royalty. But we know from the Christmas story, he wasn't. He, what was Mary, a teenager, scared teenager?
Mm-hmm. He has really humble beginnings, doesn't he? Yeah. So again, another to drop another name into the podcast there. Again, some of your listeners will have heard of Paul. The Saint Paul, the guy at the cathedral, was eventually named after. So Paul talks about that he, in one sense, he was born lowly. He kind of, there's a verse I'm thinking of, and I wish I knew it off the top of my head. You don't always know the verses off the top of your head, do you? But he was born in such humble circumstances, so that he can identify with the lowliest person. He's not come, at least the first time, because again, being a Christian, you believe he'll come again, and that second coming is a much more kind of, that's quite spectacular, if I can use that word. But his first coming was really quite humble. Yeah. So as you say, we know from the Christmas story, which most people, know just through, like childhood memories and stuff like that. Yeah. He's born in like poverty is probably the best word to describe it. Joseph, his dad, we know had a job. He was some kind of, traditionally we say carpenter. That might have meant stonemason or something like that. But he had a job, but they weren't people of means. And when he's born into like, traditionally we say stable, but he's born into a room somewhere that they would have kept animals in at night time to keep them safe from theft and predators and cold and all that kind of stuff. And he's just wrapped in cloths and then laid in a, we call it a manger again, which would probably just be like a kind of a trough thing in the ground where animal feed would be. And he's got the most humble birth that you can ever imagine. Yeah, which, as you say, when you think about it, like Son of God, born in straw or something, it just doesn't make quite sense, does it? Yeah, but
no.
Yeah. We think that he would come in like, first time round, that he would come, the heavens would split open and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, but instead he comes as a baby. Yeah.
Yeah. That must have been sort of Mary telling Joseph, she's young, she's virginal, she's pregnant. They're basically runaways.
Yeah, to some extent.
Exiles to an extent. They're so, does the Bible talk about how Joseph might have felt?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So most of those four gospels I mentioned earlier, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those four books is probably an easier kind of word for us to get our head around for it. They talk about that. And at first, Joseph was pretty shocked, I think is the best phrase to describe it, because obviously what we're getting at here, aren't we, is the idea of the virgin birth. So again, we're saying that Jesus wasn't like conceived in that kind of normal way. You know, he just was conceived by God in Mary, by the Holy Spirit. Yeah, so I'm sure we'll touch on the Holy Spirit at some point later in this podcast, but we've mentioned the phrase God the Father, we've talked about Jesus the Son, and then there's this third person of God as well, which is the Holy Spirit. So God is that word Trinity, three in one, three persons, all equally God, but still one God. And again, trying to wrap your head around it, you're trying to deal with something that's beyond human comprehension. Yeah, it's actually one of my favorite little things to realize the truth of Christianity, that nobody who's trying to invent a religion would invent something that they genuinely couldn't comprehend. That made no sense. You're dealing with something that's true, and therefore it should strike you as, this blows my mind. But anyway, back to Joseph. So he was already like engaged, betrothed to Mary, and they were already due to marry. And at one point, he thought he was going to divorce her, actually, or like break off their betrothal and their engagement, because, you know, as you can imagine, his first thoughts were probably quite, what on earth is this? You're pregnant, you know, and we haven't been together, we're not married, and so he was going to leave her, and the reason that he stayed was, again, this maybe some people have got experience of this, but he had a dream where literally in his dream an angelic figure appears to him and says, like, don't be afraid to marry Mary, you know, like, her child is from God and you need to marry her. And so he does. Yeah, so he listens to that. Yeah.
That takes some faith, doesn't it?
Sorry, what was that?
That would take some faith, relying on a dream.
It would take some, relying on a dream and doing it. Yeah, I think that would be very hard. And I remember at some point he would have had to have told people all of this as well, because obviously when they wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, etc., you know, it's just he would have had to have told this story to people throughout his life, you know, that this is why I stayed with Mary. Yeah. We don't know when Joseph leaves the book as well, either. Yeah, there's no mention of his death. No, that's so he's a figure that I look forward to talking to one day. Yeah,
that's something I didn't know.
No, it's never mentioned. Just at the start, he's there, you know, of course, and we know the whole like riding on the donkey with Mary to Bethlehem, and then there's a tale in Luke's gospel where Jesus is a child and he gets lost in Jerusalem, and Mary and Joseph like realize after a couple of days that he's gone missing, and then they start panicking because they thought he was their big family, like extended family with all the cousins and kids. You know, they thought he was amongst them, and he wasn't. And then they find him a couple of days later in the temple, and we see Joseph there saying, "Oh, thank goodness for that, you're here." You know, but that's the last we get a mention of him. And then he's, obviously by the time of Jesus' death and stuff, which we'll get to later on in our chat, he's not there after that. So most people assume he passed away at some point in between. Yeah. But whoever he was, it was quite it took some faith.
It did take some faith. Yeah. So you said Jesus, like, he went on a walkabout and he ended up sort of in a temple. So his sort of ministry started early. Didn't he say, did you not know I would be in my Father's house? Is that right?
He does say exactly that, yeah. So his ministry does, in one sense, starts immediately, doesn't it? And in another sense, it doesn't start until he's almost like 30, really. Yeah. So we have the narrative or the story of his birth, don't we? And that's in generally all of the books in here. And then we see him again at about age 12. I think it's 12, isn't it, in Luke, where that story in the temple. Yeah. So they go to Jerusalem for a festival, because obviously Israel at the time had loads and loads of festival like in the calendar throughout the year. So they go to Jerusalem for one of these festivals, and they lose him, basically, Mary and Joseph. I think it says that they thought he was basically, just like I said earlier, they thought he was amongst this like crowd that they were walking with, because it probably was their like extended family, because families would go together to the festivals and stuff. And there were lots of cousins, Jesus had brothers and sisters, he had cousins as well. So they thought he was amongst their big group as they start going back from Jerusalem back to Nazareth and stuff. And then, they realized to their horror after a couple of days, he's not there. Yeah. So they go back to Jerusalem in an absolute panic, as you can imagine. Kind of Home Alone sort of thing, isn't it? Yeah. And they find him in the temple, basically. Yeah. So Jerusalem at the time had the massive temple. It's not there anymore. In that sense, the Romans knocked it down about like 30 years after Jesus' death. Basically, all that's left is that western wall, isn't it? But they find him there, and he's sat with all the rabbis, and he's reading scriptures to them, and they're all sat there, all the rabbis who are like very learned men, who've like spent their whole life studying, are listening to this 12-year-old just essentially teach them what things mean. And just getting to exactly that verse you said, his parents are like, what have you done to us? We've been worried sick. And he says, well, didn't you know I'd be in my father's house? So even at 12, he's already instructing the expert teachers of Israel, in their Bible and in their wisdom and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And then he disappears again in the books. That is, like we don't see it again until he's ready to start what we call his ministry, which is like his proper 3-ish years of, he calls his 12 disciples and he wanders around Israel and performs all the stuff we hear about in the books. But so there's big gaps basically in his life. So we just assume he's just a really good son, in all honesty. And he looked after his parents. He probably worked with Joseph, and in that sense, if you want to talk about Jesus being relatable and stuff, like he's much more than just, I don't want to belittle in any way, but he lived for about 33-ish years, and generally the books in here, those 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, generally deal, apart from those few stories, with his last 3 years, his like public ministry. But he lived 30 years of life, where he was just living life, looking after his parents, working in his community, doing good work, just working. Yeah. So he's, if we go back to right at the start of this, where we were talking about his humanity, like he lived just 30 years of growing up, being a son, being a brother, being a cousin. Yeah. So, yeah.
So you say he's got siblings, brothers and sisters. Do we know anything about them?
We know some of them. So obviously James was one of his brothers and sisters. He's probably the most prominent one we know of. I can't actually off the top of my head remember if we know the names of any of his other siblings, but there's a couple of Jameses in the Bible. And James eventually became a committed Christian and follower of his brother, So that's one thing to note, is that for a lot of the Gospels, his brothers and sisters don't quite know what to make of him, if that makes sense. So, there's at first, I think, I don't want to go too far and say something incorrect, but I think they had to question it a lot. They had to work that through, like, who is my brother? Who is he? Because they will have known, because I can't imagine that Mary and Joseph didn't tell them about, I just conceived him, and I met an angel, and and I had an angelic dream. So they will have known these things about their brother, but it's so we don't. He had some brothers and sisters. We don't quite know how many, and at first there's times where they remain a little bit unsure as to what to make of him. But by the end of it, by the time of his death, and more importantly his resurrection, when he gets raised to life again, that's when they become, we know by then anyway, at least they'd become proper committed to his whole cause. His mother obviously had been with him through the whole lot. Mary's there at the crucifixion and everything like that. She goes to the tomb after he's died and everything. But so his brothers and sisters, they crop up a couple of times. And if James's brother eventually, we're not quite sure how, but eventually he was killed, on account of his faith, basically. But it must be, I can't imagine what it was like to grow up with Jesus as your brother. No. In that sense, I think that's absolutely incredible, quite frankly.
yeah, it would be mind blowing. And there's the thing about there was a lot of superstitions around the time as well, wasn't there? Um, I am I right in thinking that in the Old Testament there are precursors saying that Jesus will be born here and do this, and
Yeah.
so he
So
fulfilled.
yeah, there are. So we've talked a little bit already about who Jesus is, and as I said at the start, I think one of the first words were you could give so many answers to that question, and one of them would be, as you've just mentioned, he's a fulfiller, if I could use that word. So he fulfills things. He makes promises come true that have already been made. You're quite right. So um, one word that you might have heard Jesus given before, like a title, would be like Messiah. A fair few people have heard the term Messiah before, and what that basically means is in the Old Testament, you're right. So that first half of the Bible, it's more than first half actually. It's much chunkier than the New Testament bits in your Bible. But yeah, in that element of the Bible, yeah, they're waiting for this promised king to come. So the people of Israel, which were God's people at the time, were promised that someone will be sent. Who'll be my king, and this person will deliver you, and will bring all the other nations in as well. So they were going to, or basically everyone else who wasn't in Israel would also be brought into this big family of God, basically. Yeah. And so they were waiting for this figure for a long, long time, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Basically, they were waiting, who is this person? Where's he going to come? And yeah, there's loads, there's too many almost to count, really, like things in the Old Testament that say what he'll do. The most, can I say this? The most famous is probably Isaiah chapter 53. So Isaiah was what we would call a prophet, so he spoke with the authority of and the literal words of God given to him by God, and then he spoke them to Israel, and that was his job basically, as a prophet. And in his quite big book, which we've now broken down into chapters, of course, chapter 53 of that has probably the most well-known prophecies of the Messiah to come, where it basically can probably find it in about 2 clicks. Here you go, 57, 53. So this is Isaiah. He's doing a bit of prophetic stuff. So he's saying about this king who is to come, basically. And this is what he says. He grew up like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. So that's going back to what you and me were already saying about he's a baby. He worked a humble job. He was born into poverty. And that ties in there exactly, doesn't it? He had no form or majesty that we should look at him. He wasn't outwardly this spectacular figure. He's a humble man. He was despised and rejected by men. And that goes what we'll get to eventually about the crucifixion, doesn't it? Because Jesus was despised by a lot of the people in authority. They despised him and was rejected by them, basically. Yeah, surely he has borne our griefs, carried our sorrows. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And all this stuff is pointing towards the work that this future king would do. And the stuff there about bearing our griefs and our sorrows and wounded for our transgressions, that's the cross, basically. That's pointing to the cross. But yeah, so you're quite right. So this figure had been expected for a long, long time. Yeah. And then Jesus comes along and fulfills it, basically. Yeah. Some people might be skeptical of that, unless are you sure? Are you sure that's actually the case? So little tidbit, like Isaiah, for example, that book I just read from, until about 75 years ago, our oldest copy of this book dated from about 1000 AD. So people could easily kind of say well, you Christians probably just edited that and made it say what you wanted it to say, didn't you? How can I trust that, basically? But then some people have heard of things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and which are basically a bunch of old Bible manuscripts that were found completely by accident in the middle of the desert by, I think it was a young boy who lobbed a stone and he heard the smashing sound of pottery and went to investigate, and his stone had landed inside a cave containing loads of pots full of like manuscripts and stuff. But anyway, in there, they found a complete copy of Isaiah that predates the coming of Jesus by, I think it's a couple of 100 years, and they were surprised, as in the scholars were, Christians weren't, that the text matched up perfectly with the texts that had been, copied and transmitted down through the years as well. So just a little tidbit there, that some of this stuff that I just read there, Isaiah, talking about who is to come, this isn't something that's made up and invented to fit Jesus. This was already there, and then he comes and fulfills it.
Yeah. Retrospect is a wonderful thing, and we're sort of blessed with this thing now called critical reasoning. Looking at documents, and I believe that they can sort of trace those like documents from biblical documents back to pretty much like 2 or 3 years after Jesus died.
Yes, it varies. So when you look at, I like history a lot, in all honesty. And I like Bible history as well. So when you go back and look at how many manuscripts there are, someone once explained it to me, like the idea of, you write a recipe down and then you give it to your mate and ask him to copy it, and you give it to your mate and ask him to copy it, and they pass their copy to someone else. Eventually, are you going to get mistakes? Is someone going to change, are they going to change 1,000 grams to 1 kilogram or something? Like little changes like that are, technically meaningless, but also they've changed it. And so you can wonder if the same thing's happened with the Bible, basically, is what you're getting at, can't you? It's like, how do we actually know any of this stuff is reliable? But the sheer number of manuscripts that we've got for the New Testament is unlike anything else from ancient history. Like, we've got thousands upon thousands upon thousands of manuscripts. I've got it in my big study Bible here somewhere, and I'll probably be able to find it. And there's an article in here, and your listeners can look this up online, that talks about just the sheer numbers of copies of things that there are. Here you go, the reliability of the manuscripts. So take my favourite one is always, I don't think they've quoted it in here, but my favourite is always the stories of Julius Caesar when he goes and conquers what's now France and Greece. And like the number of manuscripts we've got is like a couple of dozen at most. And the latest
Gallic War. Is that right?
Yeah, Caesar's Gallic War, yeah. And the number of copies of it we've got, in the double digits, if that. And the earliest copy we've got is like 1,000 and something years after that. But when it comes to the New Testament, and I'm looking at it here, we've got about 5,700 manuscripts in Greek, 10,000 in Latin, and more than 1 million quotations from early Christians who wrote their own, because they were the same as you and I. We send WhatsApps, they used to write letters, And when we get all this stuff together, like the sheer amount of manuscripts you've got is utterly ridiculous. Yeah. And the earliest, I think, is P42, which stands for papyrus, the type of material. 42 is whatever its number is, and that's of the Gospel of John, and that does date to within a few years, I think. I can't remember off the top of my head when it is. Probably about 10 or something like that. It's probably the earliest one, but it's one of thousands upon thousands. So it's in a league of its own, basically, when it comes to the number of stuff, the number of copies of it there are. Yeah,
it is. It's
from all over the world as well. And remember, there's no central group that could control all of this.
No.
In those first few hundred years, the Christian church isn't some like centralized organization, and there's no state control over it. It's this massive group of people all over like the Mediterranean and beyond world, and all the manuscripts are scattered all throughout that whole big area as well. So the idea that somebody could have gone around and just changed every single one, it's just nonsense, in all honesty. Yeah. So it's very cool. Yeah.
So okay, so when did it start with and go public?
Go public, yes. Yeah. So that starts, so we can maybe find it in one of these books, can't we? So if I go back to, I'm going to go to Luke, because I like Luke, and that's the one we've been looking at when it comes to the birth story, haven't we, and stuff like that, and the temple when he's a boy. So I've got too many pages in this thing. There it is. I'm just there now, Jack. He says. So he's about 30 years old by this point, we think. About just, like give or take a year or something like that. Yeah. So he's about 30 years old, and that's when his like public ministry in that sense starts. There's a few glimpses beforehand of what's going to come. I think his first technical like miracle is the wedding story. That's quite a famous one that most people, again, will probably have heard of in some way or other, and it's where he turns the water into the wine. So he goes to a wedding.
Canaan.
Wedding at Cana. Yeah. And he's invited to the wedding.
Do you think, like, is that where Jesus knew that it was sort of beginning of the end?
Yeah, I mean, I think he talks about, like, through his ministry, he often uses the phrase, like, my time has not yet come. He says that quite a lot. And I think he even says that during the wedding at Cana. He says to his mum, actually, because this is his mum who he sat with. They've been invited to a mutual relation or friend's wedding, and basically, they all run out of wine at the wedding. And this was quite, I mean, even today, the idea of the wedding running out of wine is bad, but it was quite, remember this culture at the time was kind of like an honor shame based culture. So to run out of stuff to provide for your guests at a feast was quite, it brings shame on you in that sense. So his mother says to him, basically, they've run out of wine, and he basically says, what do you want me to do? My time has not yet come. And his mother keeps asking him, and being the devoted good son he is, he says, okay. And he transforms the famous story, asks all the servants at the wedding, basically, like fill up those jars with water, and then he turns them into wine. A little tidbit as well is that the bloke who then drinks it for the first time says to the wedding host, oh, you've saved the best wine until now. So I also love the idea that he made the best wine, as well. But yeah, so that's probably his first public display of what's to come. And then he properly starts it, about age 30. I don't know how close those two events were, where he goes to the River Jordan, basically. And in the River Jordan is this chap called John, who's actually Jesus' cousin. So John's mum was Mary's sister. And so they probably knew each other from childhood, in all honesty. But John had spent his, for a number of years by this point, going back to what we were talking about earlier about this Messiah figure to come. John had basically heard from God that he was to get ready for this person to come. So John left whatever job he was doing. I have no idea what career he was in. He left all of that, and he mostly spent his time in the wilderness by the River Jordan, where he would baptize people. So he was dunking them under water and then bringing them up again. It's a symbol of you've been washed of all the stuff that is sinful and that you reject now. And when you come up, it's like symbolizing that's all been washed off you now, and you're clean, if in that sense. So that's where Jesus goes. He goes to his cousin John and says, John, I need to be baptized as well. And John says, no, there's nothing to wash off you. John knows immediately who he is as well, which is quite interesting. Not just as in he recognizes his cousin, but it says that John basically falls down at his feet, and is like, this is the one, this is him, just something hits him, and he's down and bows. And then he basically protests and says, I can't baptize you. You need to baptize me. But Jesus says, no, this is something I need to do. And so John baptizes him. So he goes under, and when he comes up, everybody who's there hears a thundering voice that basically says, this is my son who I love, listen to him. And they see the Holy Spirit, that third person of God, in the looking like a radiant form of a dove, comes down and rests on him, which is symbolizing to them all that the power of God is on this man now. And then he starts his 3 years, where he then travels around and does what we'll cover in a bit, I'm sure.
So in essence, is homeless.
Yeah, mate. Yeah. So for quite a lot of for those 3 years of ministry, where he's left home, so obviously, his mother, we don't know. Joseph might have passed away at this point, might still be alive. We're not sure, but obviously, his mum was safe and being looked after by his brothers and sisters and things like that. And he then leaves home and he travels, doesn't he? He walks around this like big area of land that broadly, I guess, matches the modern state of Israel, but that whole area, he just travels around. And he doesn't have a permanent home. He's supported throughout his ministry by like the donations of people, basically. So he's got followers who support him, just to buy the essentials he needs. By the end of his life, and again, I don't want to jump ahead too far, but by the end of his life, he's literally just got the clothes on his back. That's all he has at the end of it. Basically, he's just got those clothes. Yeah, all the money that he received in that sense was just enough for him and his disciples to live on, basically, and to do good with, basically. So he doesn't have a home. It says something. I think there's a verse somewhere in the Bible where Jesus says it in a kind of a poetic way, where he says, like, the Son of Man, which is a title he often used for himself, which again, I guess, emphasizes his humanness, doesn't it? Son of God, Son of Man, both at the same time. He says the Son of Man hasn't got anywhere to lay his head. It's kind of a poetic way of saying that, basically. I don't have a home. He's homeless. Yeah. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that at all, because it's true. He doesn't have one. Yeah.
So there's like lots of stories about the sort of miracles that he did, feeding 5,000. Was that like 5,000, like exactly 5,000, or was it 5,000 men and then their families?
Yeah. So 5,000 plus. Yeah. So the common like counting system at the time for people doesn't quite tie in with how we would do it in the modern world. A bit more, but anyway, but in that time, they were just basically, it was just counting the number of men, basically. And then it says, I think one of them says, I think it even says like there were 5,000 men plus women and children. So, we can all try and do our maths and probably fail as to how many women and plus kids there. Who knows? But lots and lots of people. And that's one of his big public miracles. He does loads of miracles throughout the books of the Bible. By miracle, we just mean something he does. I mean, most people would know what we mean, but something that breaks the laws of nature, if I can use that phrase. Something that shouldn't happen. That's what we're talking about when we say miracle. Yeah. And so some of them are small. He does in like private rooms with individual people. Like there's some people where there's a story in there, isn't there, where a little girl who he knows their family has died, and everybody's distraught, quite frankly, utterly distraught. And he just goes into the room with the parents and maybe two of his disciples, and he raises that little girl from the dead, So that's like a little, I could almost call it a private one, like it's quite, the audience who saw it was small. But this one that you've just mentioned is one of the reasons he became so popular amongst people in Israel, because in front of tens of thousands of people, they get there. A lot of people have heard the story before. Jesus teaches them first. So he spends a long time teaching them and talking to them. We know sometimes probably some of the things he said, other times we don't, what he was teaching on. And then, one of his disciples, because he had 12 like key friends, 12 blokes who followed him around, basically, who he'd sort of selected to be his close companions. And they say something along the lines of, it's getting really late, shall we send everybody away now because they need to eat, basically? And Jesus says effectively, like, no, asks, what food have you got? And they say, I've got not very much at all. I can't buy enough food on my fisherman's wage to feed 15,000 people or whatever it is. And little boy comes up, basically, and one of the disciples says, this lad who's got a couple of loaves of bread and some fish. And Jesus basically says, give it to the people. So I don't know what they did. They break it. Jesus says a blessing. It's kind of like reminiscent of like communion and stuff, isn't it? Like breaks the bread and blesses it, says a prayer over it, puts it into some, I don't know, like wicker baskets, the type of thing that fishermen probably have strung over their back for when they were at work. And as they go around the crowd, it doesn't end. So that everybody just takes bread and there's more bread. Everybody takes fish and there's more fish, And that one is quite enormous in its scale, really. So again, going back to that bit right at the start, who is Jesus? Well, he's fully man because he eats as well. He needs food. But who makes something out of nothing? Only that's the realm of God, isn't it? Is the whole making something out of nothing, and that's what he's showing there, basically. Yeah, and so everybody eats, and it says they were all satisfied, so there was enough food for people to eat until they were sort of stuffed, basically, and that there was still leftovers as well. Yeah, so yeah, that's his first big one.
You'd think if he did all that, it'd be beloved by everybody. He's feeding people, he's raising people from the dead.
Yeah.
That's not the case, though, is it?
Not always, no. So broadly speaking, yeah, he became very, very popular with an awful lot of people. Yeah, a lot of the common people, if I can use that kind of phrase, just the irregular average Joe, basically. No pun intended. Yeah, he became really popular with because he cared for them. He healed them of their sicknesses. People would bring people who were sick to him. There's that story of those mates who brought their friend who had been paralyzed for however many years, and they hear Jesus in a certain house, so they literally smash the roof down to lower their friend in on his bed to get him to Jesus, and then Jesus heals him. So he had huge popularity, but that then meant that sadly, what happened was with some people he was decidedly not popular at all. And you and I, if you were there on Sunday, Jack, our pastor at Hope Church, Mark, did a talk that kind of covered this to some extent on Sunday, that a lot of people ended up being very afraid, but not like afraid in an honest way. It was kind of like, I'm afraid because I sense you as a threat to my position, if you know what I mean. So to a lot of the authority figures, they despised him. To quote Isaiah, they rejected him. They didn't view him as the Messiah. They despised what he was doing because he kind of exposed their hypocritical nature to everybody. So there's a couple of examples of where he does that. There's the one, again, that a lot of people will have heard of, where he goes to the temple and he finds that, it's supposed to be the place where people go to pray and to meet with God. And instead, when he gets there, a lot of the authority figures have been very complicit or are just taking part in turning it basically into a market, where everybody's just buying and selling and all the things that the people need in order to meet with God at the temple. Things like doves. There was lots of animal stuff in the Old Testament, and they have to buy that from a special stand at the temple for a big inflated price. And Jesus is outraged with this. And he goes in there and he flips over all their tables, basically. And I think he also makes a whip. He makes a whip, and he starts chasing all these people out of the temple, saying, like, how dare you turn this place that's where my father's meant to be praised and where people meet with him into basically like a con for you to make money. He's outraged by that. So that threatens those people. They don't like that. And then obviously the more he's popular with a lot of, the population, they're now listening to him. They're not listening to the authority figures. So again, they don't like that because they're losing their influential status in society and stuff. So so they hated him, like truly hated him. Yeah. And then the other group of people who viewed him with a lot of suspicion, obviously the Romans as well, because obviously if you're Pontius Pilate, again, most of you have heard of him. He's the Roman guy who eventually gave the order, so to speak, to kill Jesus and crucify him. Pilate was threatened by it all as well, because his job was to, obviously the Romans conquered Israel, and his job is to just make sure that everything just ticks along nice and ordered. Everybody pays their taxes and life's good. So if he sees anything that could upset that and cause a problem for Rome, he doesn't like that. And so eventually he views that as something that Jesus is causing him, because he looks at it and goes, no, this is causing me too much trouble. And so he doesn't like him either. Yeah. But so to go back to your point, mate, he was not popular with some people at all. Yeah.
And he knew
not through anything that, Go on.
So he knew all this was coming?
Yeah, he did. Yeah. So again, at various points in there, he talks about like what is to come. So he'll say phrases like, he says so going back, if we tie these two little strands together, these authority figures, there's one day where he's standing outside in the temple, and I want to find the verse while I'm talking about it. The joy of smartphones with the search feature on any. So he's standing outside the temple. Bear with me. If I can't find it quickly, I'll just carry on because I don't want to delay us while I look through all these ones. But basically, he's standing outside the temple and he says to the people around him something along the lines of, if you tear down this temple, I will raise it up in 3 days. And all the authority figures who are there start mocking and laughing at him because they say, mate, it took us 200 years as a nation to build this thing, and you're going to knock it down and have it rebuilt in 3 days, which obviously, so they think, ha ha ha, aren't we so smart? Isn't this man so ridiculous? But what Jesus is talking about is himself, i.e., if you knock me down, if you demolish me, you kill me, in 3 days' time, I'll raise it up, which is 3 days after I've died, I'll come back to life again. So he knew what was coming. Yeah, when he's about to face the cross, and he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's praying alone at night, and he knows that's why he came. That this was why he was sent into the world, and this is where we get back again, focusing on our question of who is Jesus. Like he came willingly, always knowing that the end was going to be his horrendous death, absolutely awful. He knew what would come after it, and he looked to that part with great joy that he'd be raised, and that he would save all these people. But that's the key word, save. So who is Jesus? In that sense, he's the savior. So he came purposely to the world, set aside all his great glory that he had in heaven, decided to take on the body of a man, just like you and me, and then he lived that perfect life, knowing that at the end of it he would then die. And the idea is that he died on our behalf. So I'm sure we'll cover that at some point in this chat, or we can cover it now. But yeah, he knew what was coming the whole time.
Yeah. Well, this is where we get into the sort of Easter story. We're coming up to Easter. This is one of the reasons I wanted to do this. My wife really wanted to hear sort of the Easter story in a way that she could understand. She suggested doing these things. So it's her that God really put it on her heart to do that. But we come up to the Easter story. Jesus is, they think, is a menace. They
basically, these authority figures do. Yeah,
I've heard him called. I've heard people call him a terrorist.
Yeah.
Go that far?
I think
was he viewed as a terrorist by the authorities?
I don't know. What they use some pretty unpleasant language to describe him. In all honesty, some things I don't actually want to repeat that they say, but they view him as, they despise him, utterly despise him. Yeah, because he's a threat to their power, and he's a threat to their status. Because everybody looks at him and then compares them to him and realize that Jesus is genuine and loves people, and that they don't. They care about their status, their money, and they care about power ultimately, and they don't like anyone who threatens that. And then so we get to the Easter story as we now know it, basically. Where they decide that by which I mean the authority figures. Often in the Bible, they'll be grouped together as the Pharisees, or the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These are like Old Testament words, or not even Old Testament, but they're the words used to describe their kind of like specific religious role within, and like administrative role rather, within society. And they decide that they're going to kill him, basically. And most people have heard how it kind of plays out, haven't they? In that they find someone willing to betray him, basically. Judas. So out of his 12, we learn that one of them is I don't know how to describe it, but he's not on board with Jesus's like ministry and life. It talks about how before we get to this point, apparently Judas had been stealing money from the ministry for a long time. So Judas was in charge of the money bag. Yeah, so Judas was in charge of the money bag. And there's one of the writers, I can't remember which book it's in. There's a scene where a lady comes up to Jesus and she smashes a jar of perfume and then anoints him with the perfume, basically, in like a, she recognizes who he is. And this is a lady who I think views herself as having done some absolutely awful things with her life and has totally messed it up, basically. But she knows that Jesus won't reject her, even though society will and the authorities would. She knows Jesus won't, and he doesn't. He completely welcomes this lady, completely. And again, that's another reason they hate him, because they accuse him of hanging out with tax collectors. I mean, we're a bit ambivalent towards the tax man now, but back then he was viewed as a collaborator with the Romans, who stole from you, and sinners, which was their catch-all term that often they would apply to women. I don't know if she was probably involved in like sex work or something like that, but they viewed her as totally beneath them, even worth acknowledging. They did, they had no time for her whatsoever, but Jesus did, and says to her, come, I can cleanse you of anything that you are like you hate about yourself. I can cleanse you of anything like that. And she smashes this jar of perfume and anoints him with it, like a really expensive, fragrant, perfumey type stuff. And so getting back to our point with this is Judas says basically, what's she done this for? Should we not have sold this perfume? Because it was a whole jug and we could have got lots of money and given it to the poor. And whichever writer it is basically says Judas didn't say this because he cared about the poor. It was because he helped himself to the money in the money bag, because that was his job amongst the 12, was he was the one who carried the money bag, basically, for giving out and buying food and for giving to the poor. And he used to help himself to what was in it. Yeah. So, and eventually he betrays him. Yeah. So he is tasked by the authorities of basically finding a time and a place where Jesus isn't with the crowds, because they knew they wouldn't be able to arrest him if all the crowds were about, because the people loved him. But if they could get him alone with just his group of followers, then they could have him, basically. And Judas does that for them. Yeah, finds where he's going, because he probably knows the diary, doesn't he? And then tells them where to find him, and then betrays him with a kiss. Identifies him to the equivalent of the police. It's him. That's the man you want. And then Jesus is arrested. Yeah.
And Jesus knew this was going to happen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So they have a supper before that, like the night before, I think it is, isn't it? The Last Supper, the famous painting and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And while they're at that supper, Jesus tells them again, like, what's about to happen to him. And he even symbolizes it with the food they're eating. So he takes the bread, doesn't he? And he breaks the bread and says, this bread is my body, eat this and remember me. And that's what Christians still do to this day. We'll go to church and literally we'll eat bread together, and it's a symbol that we remember what Jesus has done for us. His body was ripped apart like the bread was for us, and also that we're family. We share this meal together and remember him together. And he also then pours out some wine and says to them, drink this cup, this is my blood. Again, like we remember when we drink that he shed his blood for us, for me, at the same time. And so at that meal, he knows what's going to happen. He's telling them, this is my body, it's broken for you. This is my blood, it's been poured out for you. So even the night before, he knows what's coming the next day. And at that meal, he even starts talking about one of you will betray me. And all the disciples get very worried by this, because they all start saying, like, is it me? Who is it? Because at this point, they all know. They've been with him 3 years. They're like, he knows everything. He knows what's happening tomorrow. They know. And so they're all terrified, really, to some extent. And Jesus says, no, it's the person I give this like morsel of bread to. And he dips a piece of bread in the wine and gives it to Judas, who then eats it. And then Judas leaves. I think Jesus even says to him, like, what you're about to do quickly. And Judas does. He just goes off and does it. And the other disciples, I don't think, quite clock what's going to happen, though. There's this sense throughout the Gospels that what was going to happen, Jesus knew it fully, but a lot of his disciples didn't really understand whether or not it was kind of kept from them a little bit, or if they just couldn't quite grasp it. But for whatever reason, they didn't quite fully understand what that meant. But Jesus did. Yeah.
And he was denied by his was it Peter? He was his most
Peter.
loyal as well, wasn't
he? Yeah. So we've got to the arrest. So Judas betrays him, and with the kiss, which is grim. And then Judas like flees or whatever, and then Jesus is arrested and he's dragged before Herod, who's like the puppet king of Israel. I call him the puppet king because the real like authorities were the Romans. They're really in charge, but the Romans were very good at adopting to the place they'd conquered, i.e. like you can keep most of your stuff. All we ask is you pay us all your taxes and you don't do this, you don't do that. Yeah. So they would keep people like Herod in place. So he's dragged before Herod, and Herod, is baffled by him basically and doesn't like him at all and wants to get rid of him because, again, Herod sees him as a threat because people at this point are calling Jesus the Messiah, the king, and Herod doesn't like that because I'm the king, So, then he gets hauled before the religious authorities and they slap him, they spit at him, they ask him all these questions and they hate all his answers. Even when he just tells them what he's already said before, just hearing it afresh, they hate him for it. And then he finally gets dragged, before Pilate, the Roman governor, who eventually sentences him to death. And while all this is going on, all the disciples are in absolute chaos, really. They don't know what on earth is going on. And some of them kind of follow, I guess, behind the group of soldiers that have arrested Jesus and bring him to all these places. And they follow in secret, basically. And Peter's one of them. Peter could be described as like the first among equals of Jesus' 12 disciples. Like his original name actually is Simon. That's his actual name. Peter is his nickname that Jesus gave him that means rock or rocky. Like Jesus viewed him as this like, you're this rock, like firm ground. And on this, I'm going to build my church, this kind of that sort of idea. And Peter's asked a couple of times, once by, I think it's a girl who is working as the equivalent of like a waitress or something at wherever they're at. She asks him like, don't I recognize you? Aren't you one of his friends? And Peter says, no, I have no idea who this man is. I've never met him before in my life. And then he's talking to a bunch of other guys not that long later, and he's warming his hands by a fire. And he's asked, I'm sure you're one of his, aren't you? And again, he says, I keep telling you, I don't have a clue who this man is. And then a third time, it says he denied it with a curse. I don't know what that means. If he means like, if he's swearing like, I swear by God, I don't know him, or if it's like a sweary type thing. I don't actually know what that little word means in that context. But he says again, really strongly this time, I do not know him. And to go back to who is Jesus, and we've talked about his abilities in terms of his power, Jesus knew that Peter was going to do this as well. Because that night before, when they're having their supper, Jesus says to Peter, when they're having that discussion about one of you's going to betray me, Peter basically comes out with to all extents and purposes, it's like everyone else might do this, but I'll never betray you. And Jesus says to him, Peter, Satan, the devil, has asked to sift you like wheat, which is like, we're basically grinding it all down to make flour, basically, and bread. And then Jesus says, but I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you've turned back, look like strengthen your friends, your brothers. So Jesus knew Peter was going to betray him as well, which adds to the horror of what Jesus goes through, actually, because this he watches his friends melt away. He watches his best friend deny 3 times that he's never met him before, because obviously Peter's afraid that he'll be arrested as well. Everyone abandons him and he's completely alone. And so Jesus was even betrayed in that sense. He by his own. I don't know if betrayed is the right word, but Peter denied him 3 times. And Jesus knew this was going to happen. And Peter obviously remembered this, because it says after Peter's 3rd denial, after the 3rd time of saying, I don't know this man, Jesus had told him in that little bit I mentioned a couple of seconds ago that before the rooster crows, you will have denied me 3 times. And it says that as soon as Peter's finished his 3rd denial, I guess the night is gone now and it's coming up to morning and the rooster crows, and it says Peter heard this and obviously remembers what Jesus said, and it says he goes out and weeps bitterly, which I think is quite an understated phrase. He just goes out and sobs uncontrollably, basically, that my best friend's about to die and I've just betrayed him, and everything I thought I was wrong, basically. And he's just it's not happy at this point.
Oh,
Honestly, it's a horrible part of it. There's so much just unpleasantness, and it's just grim what Jesus has to go through. Yeah.
Well, this is what I want people to know. This this is the whole reason of me doing these things and in the way that we do, because it's not all love and light, is it?
It's real.
It was an awful death as well, wasn't it?
Yeah. It's absolutely awful. Yeah.
So you've got is it Pilate, and he's like, well, I'll release one of them. I'll release one of these people.
Yeah.
Why didn't people say, well, if he was so beloved, why didn't they say, well, Jesus?
Yeah. So Pilate has the ultimate say, and this is again what Mark was mentioning on Sunday, the Romans contained or kept the power of life and death to themselves. They didn't. That was something that only they could give out the death penalty. I guess it cemented their authority. Everybody knows we're in charge. And Pilate has a custom, or there is a custom that I forget the exact reasoning for it, but that at a certain time of year, the Romans will release one prisoner who otherwise is going to die, and they'll release them back into society and kind of give them a pardon, basically. And Jesus is up there, one of the two, and the other guy is a man called Barabbas. And Barabbas is he's like a robber and a murderer, that kind of, whatever he's done. I mean, I don't think you have to do much to make the Romans kill you, but whatever he's done, he's sentenced to death. And he's not a nice character in that sense. And it's amazing, that turn in the people who, as you say, and as we talked about, a lot of them absolutely adored him. And at this point, huge numbers of people still did adore him. But by this point, the same people who had welcomed him into Jerusalem a week earlier, with cheering for him, waving palm branches, all this kind of thing. Now the crowd starts shouting, whipped up by the authority figures, free Barabbas, get rid of Jesus, free Barabbas. Yeah. And there's a really shocking bit where Pilate says to them all, are you sure? Should I really kill your king? Because at this point, Jesus has told him, that I have a kingdom that's not of this world. I'm in control of you, mate. You think you're in control? It's actually me. And Pilate says to them all, should I release to you your king, of the Jews? And the authority figures basically shout back something like, they shout back, we have no king but Caesar, which at the time was a really shocking statement, because the whole identity of the country at the time was based on the idea that God is the king, and they were basically now saying it's actually Caesar. And they reject him, and Pilate is released, and Jesus is sentenced to death by crucifixion.
He was ridiculed, right?
Yeah, he's ridiculed. So after he's sentenced, no, it's before he's even sentenced, actually, just as part of the whole, if you're in a Roman jail cell, it's an unpleasant experience from the get-go. Yeah, he's beaten, basically. He's just beaten up. They strip all his clothes off him, and then mockingly, because they've heard, I guess the soldiers have heard, this guy's in there and he's pretending to be a king. Obviously, they mock him for this, so they stick a crown of thorns on him, and we're not talking blackberry thorns. We're talking, big, nasty, horrible, in all honesty. Yeah. And they stick a crown of that and stick it into his head. Yeah. And then they put a purple robe on him, which is the color that the emperors used to wear. Yeah. And so it's like a big mockery of him, basically. And then they take him out before the crowd. So he's mocked as, humiliated in that sense. Yeah.
The crowd spit at him and throw things at him.
Yeah. Yeah, the crowd are chanting, saying, crucify him, crucify him. Yeah. So they're whipped up into this frenzy basically to get rid of him. Yeah, and Pilate gives in because again, Pilate's motive throughout the whole thing is I need to keep control of this. Yeah, it's basically Pilate's thinking if I let this country go into a state of like I don't know civil war or something, obviously I'm the one who's going to have to go back to Rome and explain to the emperor how I let it all go wrong, and he doesn't want his career to end or his life. I don't know what the punishment was if he messed up as a governor, but obviously for Pilate, the easy way out is to just say, fine, whatever, you do it. That's fine. I'm done with this now because he sees it as just solving a problem, doesn't he? Yeah. And then the sentence is passed and Jesus gets sentenced to death. Yeah.
Which is gruesome with the whole crucifixion.
Yeah.
Is gruesome.
Yeah, he's flogged first, which is, I don't know, if I'm seeing your background of like films and stuff like that. If you've watched, I don't know, the one that springs to my mind is something like 12 Years a Slave. There's, that's got scenes like that in there, isn't it? And obviously, if you've seen The Passion of the Christ as well, the Mel Gibson film. But yeah, he's flogged first, which is, tears flesh off bone, basically. It didn't take many lashes to kill you, in all honesty, because you die of shock and blood loss. Yeah, so he's flogged, and then they make him carry his own cross. As another humiliating, horrible insult. Yeah, I don't know if that was just the top bar. It's kind of beside the point to some extent as to how was it the complete cross or was it the big beam at the top? It doesn't. Either way, it is horrendously heavy, big piece of wood, and you're a beaten, bruised, bloodied, flogged man. Like that thing's going to just be sinking into you. And yeah, he carries it through the city, basically. Yeah.
And then he's put up on the cross.
Yeah. In between two others. Yeah.
Through the hands.
Yeah, through the hands or wrists. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I don't think there were. I've seen debate if it was wrist or hand, but I doubt Roman soldiers were that. Like they didn't really this. Yeah, and then through the feet, and then he's left to hang there basically. Yeah, there was a death reserved for slaves and other people. If you're a Roman citizen, you couldn't be crucified. For example, they knew that this was a punishment the Romans knew was horrific. And their own laws protected their own citizens from it. So Roman citizens could still be given the death penalty, but they would get a merciful death, like of some other nature. But Jesus was given no such protection or anything. And he's up there for about hours, isn't it? Yeah, you die from just like you can't breathe. Basically, you just like die of utter exhaustion. From being up there because you can't breathe.
I mean, it truly is a brutal thing, and there were people watching him, and there's the story of the thief.
Yeah, there's a couple of guys who were crucified at the same time as him. So I guess the Romans just got rid of all of the people they wanted to get rid of on that particular day, and there's one guy on one side of him, one guy on the other, and Jesus in the middle on the middle cross. And at first they're both hurling insults at him and mocking him as well, because they probably know who he is, obviously, because Jesus was very well known, so they would know who he is. And they basically start saying to him, like, if you are who you say you are, then come down, save yourself, save us, and put an end to all this. And obviously, I think Jesus at one point even says he could do that, remember, because he says around this time, just before he goes to the cross, like, at any point I could summon like 12 legions of angels and this could just end like that. So he chooses to die. And we'll get to the reason, I hope, before we end. But so they start mocking him for that. And then I guess a couple of hours pass because he's up there for many hours. In the book, when you read it, it's only a couple of paragraphs, but it's taken place over like 6, however many hours it is. And one of them changes their mind, basically. And starts to say, I guess you reflect, don't you, when you're in that state? And he eventually says to Jesus, or says to the other thief, says to him, like, why are we mocking this guy? Like, we're up here because we deserve it. So I don't know what crimes they've done, but he has a total change of heart and realizes, like, I've got this I'm here because of my own life choices, basically, and he says to Jesus, like, Jesus, please remember me when you come into your kingdom. So at this point, this man is now completely converted to being a follower of Jesus while he's hanging on the cross. He just has a total change of heart. He's like, this man's done nothing wrong. He's not like me. And he even basically acknowledges that what Jesus has been saying throughout his public ministry is true, because obviously this whole time Jesus is doing all these miracles, has been saying, I'm here to save you. I am the king. And this man eventually comes to accept it and says, remember me when you come in your kingdom. And then Jesus turns to this bloke and just says to him, through whatever breath he can muster at this point, he just says, basically, today you'll be with me in paradise. So he basically just promises this guy next to him, like, you'll be with me very soon in heaven, and it's the most amazing story, basically. Well, story always makes it sound like it's a tale. It's just the most amazing account of what happened to this bloke in the last minutes of his life. So he's done, again, whatever he's done, he's not done stuff that we class as good, because he's got himself arrested and about to be, or actually being crucified. He's done nothing to earn any forgiveness. He's done nothing to make up for whatever it was he'd done. He's got no choice. He's on a cross. He's done nothing whatsoever. All he's done is look to Jesus, and basically it's along the lines of, I'm so sorry. Please remember me. And that's the wonderful thing about Jesus, is that as soon as anyone looks to him, just like this bloke here, nothing to offer at all, nothing. Jesus doesn't want anything that people have got to offer him, because I haven't got anything to offer him, quite frankly. I've got nothing to offer him. But he just immediately turns to this bloke and just says, you'll be with me today. Immediate, on the spot, you're forgiven. You're mine. And starting today, you're in paradise. For the rest of eternity, you will live in nothing but pure joy as you see more of God each day, and every day is better than the last. And this bloke literally just turns to him and says, remember me. And immediately Jesus does. Yeah.
So he's gone through his life and he's done all this, and and he finds himself on the cross. Why?
Yeah, so we've covered, I guess, haven't we? We've covered a lot of the human bits of the why, i.e. threat to power and threat to control and all that kind of stuff. And we've talked a little bit about the idea that Jesus knew this was going to happen, and that this was actually part of the plan. And this is the real part of the cross that can be focused on in the here and now, is, as you say, why go to the cross? Why? And this is the whole central part of what it is to be a Christian in that sense. So you start with the problem in one sense, which is that there's this, how can I even describe it? A thing, there is sin, basically. Sometimes that you've done something that is sinful. At other times, you might not know even the word sin, but you just know this is wrong. This was really wrong. And that's your conscience reacting to sin. Even if you've never heard that word, even if you've never used that word, it's that thing. But ultimately, what it is you can sin against yourself. I feel horrible. I feel disgusting. I feel whatever. But ultimately, it's against God as well, because God created this whole world to be a beautiful paradise and for people to be with him forever. And God is perfectly good, so he cannot stand the presence of evil, because he is perfect in every way. But this is the real gospel stuff here, isn't it? But God so loves the world that he gave his only son, Jesus. So this is why the cross, basically. So that bit in Isaiah we read about him being wounded for our transgressions, or our sins, our mistakes, our mess ups. He's wounded for them, and he's crushed for our sins, basically. So all that stuff that definitely me, lots of people have done, the whole world has done, basically, that is horrid, Jesus essentially takes. I've got some envelopes here I was using for bookmarks actually while we were talking, and I heard it described to me once as like, take your piece of paper and write down the worst things you've ever done. Basically, write them down, and then it's like Jesus basically says, give me that paper. So it's not my hand anymore; it's in His. And then He sticks it onto Himself. And He puts that arm on the cross, and then the nail goes through it, and it's like paying the penalty, basically. And sometimes this is really hard to get your head around, and sometimes it's really hard to accept. Sometimes you think, goodness me, I need someone to take this off me, because you just know this. I despise this, and you run for it. Like, yes, there's someone who's willing to forgive me. Sometimes, if you can't think of anything, well, I haven't actually done anything that bad, that's harder to get your head around. But the Bible describes this as a universal problem for all of us, basically. So that's the why of the cross. So you would have been subject to the punishment. I'm going to die one day. We're all going to die one day, and we'll stand before God. And that's where God will say, give me an account, essentially. And we've got a problem if we go there and we're covered in these things, basically, that we haven't dealt with. They're still ours, but Jesus stands there and says, give them to me. Give them to me. I'll take that. Doesn't matter what it says. I don't care. I'll take that. And He takes all of it on Himself. And then the punishment of God hits Him. He is hit by the punishment of God on that cross. And therefore you won't be anymore, because it's gone. It doesn't matter how big yours is. How many people are in heaven right now? There must be millions upon millions of people. There's not one person, either you, me, or anyone else who's listening to this, whose individual things they've done wrong can possibly outweigh the wrong things of a couple of million people in heaven. It's just not. So it doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. He can deal with it. Yeah. And then He's raised, and that's where we get to the real glorious stuff after this. So that's why the cross. There's lots of reasons why the cross, but the core one for everyone is it takes away the punishment that should have hit us, and He takes it on Himself. Yeah. Because so He is love. Yeah.
Yeah. So He didn't just die for us, He died as us, in our place.
Yeah, in our place, basically. Yeah. So again, use an analogy of the dock in the court. Like someone goes in the dock to answer for their crimes, and then at the last second, someone else comes and stands in that dock and says, "Actually, I'll take it." Now, in our court system, that would be like, no, you can't do that. But this is because the person who's now offering themselves, which is Jesus. Again, we talked about His life and this 30 years that He led. He was perfect, and this is the thing about Jesus. He doesn't have any of these things. He doesn't have any impurities. He doesn't have any sin. He's the only person who's ever lived who hasn't had any of that. So when He offers Himself up, He's perfect, and therefore He can take the sin of everybody else because He has none of His own. Yeah, none of His own. Yeah.
I think the only thing that I can sort of put it into a human thing would be the story of, I don't know if you know the story of Maximilian Kolbe and Francis Kajicek.
No, you'd have to tell me, mate. I don't know it.
So during the Second World War, I think it was at a concentration camp in Poland, I believe, and there was an escape. And the guards had said, right, there's been an escape, we must punish somebody. And they chose, I think, 10 people to die in this starvation bunker. And among those 10 people, there was a man by the name of Francis Kajicek. And he broke down and he said, I can't die. I've got children, I've got a wife. They would miss me. I would miss them. And from the crowd, a man stepped forward by the name of Maximilian Kolbe, and he said, "Look, I'm a priest. I don't have any family. I'm not married. Don't have any children. Please let me
take his,
go in his place.
Yeah.
And miraculously, they let him.
Amazing.
That's not the end of the story. They put him into this bunker with these 9 other people, and a starvation monkey would die within days. And by the end, it was into the weeks, and he had them all singing,
amazing,
glorifying God,
amazing,
and they wouldn't die. And they were ended up being executed by lethal injection. But that is the only. In fact, I think the Pope, said one of the popes said, he brought this comparison into.
It is, isn't it?
And he
I'll
made
take your place. Yeah,
he made Maximilian Kolbe
like a saint or whatever. Yeah,
a saint. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a perfect example of it. No, that's a perfect example of it. In all honesty, isn't it? Yeah. No, that's amazing. Yeah. So that's the why, and then we get to the climax of it all, don't we? The final part, because obviously at this point, everybody's pretty. The picture's quite grim. Put yourself in their shoes, his disciples, his friends, his family, who don't know what's about to come next. This looks like utter disaster for them all. Like they're probably having huge questions of like, was it all, was it worth it? Did I get all this wrong? What has happened? How could this have happened? I thought he was the king, the Messiah, and how he's gone. They're in bits, basically. Yeah, they're all scattered, and they all eventually meet up in I can't remember whose house or where it is, but they're all together, basically, just probably commiserating, crying, not knowing what to do. And it says some of the women, I think there's a couple of Marys. There's lots of Marys. There's Mary Magdalene. There's Mary, the mother of Jesus. There's Mary, the wife of Clopas. There's loads of Marys, and some of the Marys and some of the other women go to the tomb where Jesus has been buried. It was an expensive tomb, because one of his followers, I wouldn't say covert, but one of his followers was a man called Joseph of Arimathea, who was a wealthy man, and he donated what would have been his tomb to Jesus, basically. Yeah. So they go to this tomb, and they get there and find that the big stone that was rolled over, because it's like a cave type tomb, basically, is rolled away, and they obviously peer inside, and there's no body there, and they all start panicking, I think is actually the best word. And Mary starts, I think it's Magdalene, starts sobbing uncontrollably, because she thinks that the Romans and the authorities have basically gone, we can't have him now become a shrine, for people to keep his memory going. So they assume that his body's been stolen and has been taken somewhere else. And then, as Mary is crying, she hears a voice behind her, and she assumes that it's the gardener, because again, Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, wealthy man, probably in a very nice area. His tomb was probably amongst a load of gardens and other nice things, basically. Yeah. And she assumes that this bloke's the gardener, basically, and she starts saying, I guess she's probably crying, her eyes are full of tears. I don't know how she doesn't notice in that sense, but she doesn't. She starts saying, Sir, if you're the gardener, please tell me where they've taken him, because they've stolen him. And then she hears the gardener call her name, and just says Mary. And it's like she immediately knows that voice, and she turns, and it's Jesus, basically. And she cannot believe what she is seeing, and tries to just cling on to him. And he basically says, like, don't cling on to me. Go and tell my friends. Go and tell Peter. I think he names Peter specifically, and says, go and tell them. And then she does, basically. Yeah, I find that interesting. Like, don't cling to me. It's like he almost wants her, like, now's the time to start spreading this message. Straight from the get-go, it's like time to spread it. And so she legs it to the to where the disciples are and tells them all. And surprise, of course, not many of them believe her off the bat, because they think that she's probably just mad with grief, basically, and that she's hallucinating him. Some of them seem a bit more open to it than others, but broadly speaking, I think they're very skeptical. So Peter and some of the others leg it to the tomb to find out, probably not to find if Jesus is actually alive, but probably thinking, oh my goodness, they've stolen his body, and they're probably trying to find a trail to follow or something. And they get there, and Peter goes into the tomb and picks up the cloths that Jesus was wrapped in and is like, he's gone. Peter goes out, and who does Peter see? And the other disciples they see Jesus as well. And then it says this great story of them going back and forth, back and forth. They then leg it back to the house where the rest of the disciples were, and they're like, she's not making it up. He's alive, guys. And you finally get Thomas, who unfortunately is now always nicknamed Doubting Thomas. That's where that phrase comes from, because Thomas still doesn't believe it and says to the effect of like, unless I touch the marks in his hands and put my finger in his side, by which he means Jesus, when he was on the cross after he died, the Romans stabbed him with a spear to make sure he was dead, basically. And Thomas wants to have physical proof, basically. And then not so long after he said this, Jesus, I don't know if the phrase appears is quite right, but they just find him in the room with them. Like I think it even says at one point before the doors were locked. So this is the son. This is the Son of God. He's just amongst them, and they're all obviously like, "Oh my, what on earth is going on?" And Jesus basically singles out Thomas and says, "Come here." And Jesus puts his hand in his finger in his hand and puts his finger in his side and says to him basically, "Now do you believe?" And then Thomas falls down on the floor at that point and says like, "You're my Lord and you're my God." Yeah. And that's the culmination of all these gospels, is it ends with that resurrection, basically, of he is alive, and then he tells them what they're to do next, which is to go throughout the entire world as best they can in whatever lifespan they have and tell everyone about him and share him with everyone. And we're products of that to this day, because that's 2,000 years later and however many billions of people later.
It does amaze me. Well, one thing that really gets me is that his followers, none of them had an easy life after Jesus left our plane. They were all like murdered, and
they had their heart. I think it's paradoxical, isn't it? In that they probably were they were so happy all the time, even in the midst of absolute misery, because they didn't have a nice time after that. We think from like the early Christians who wrote it down, who generally, some of them will have known the disciples and some of them will have like known the people who knew them, but most of them met unpleasant ends. Peter was famously crucified upside down, because he said that he wasn't worthy to die the same way up as Jesus. So he was crucified upside down. A lot of the other ones, they were exiled, put to death. Some of them disappeared on their missionary journeys and stuff like that. But you don't. I've heard it said before. Am I just a bit of a nutter, basically? And it's like, well, I've heard of people who've. I think there's two things actually I've heard. It's either I'm a complete nutter, or I must be some sort of scheming individual who wants to basically like con people or extort people. And have you noticed ever before that these two arguments basically cancel one another out? Because on one hand, I'm really intelligent and scheming and plotting to create something for power, while simultaneously I must be a complete idiot. And those two things cancel each other out. The simplest explanation for them is that they saw him and they died for what they knew was real. As in like, if I'm a con artist, I think I'd probably stop short of going to die for it.
Why lie?
Yeah. And if I'm just delusional, well, there were an awful lot of them. And it says in the books as well that it wasn't just these group of people who saw him alive either. It says that in one of Paul's letters, one of the sort of next load of apostles, that Jesus appeared to Peter and the disciples, and then Paul says he also appeared to over 250 of us fellow Christians as well. And Paul even says some of whom are still alive, because Paul's writing a letter to a church that has got kind of muddled up on the resurrection, and they don't know what it means for them. And Paul's basically saying what it means is you're going to raise again with a body. If you need a reminder of this, go and speak to Dave, because Dave was there and he can tell you what it was like to see Jesus alive. Yeah. So so it's quite epic.
How do we have a relationship with God?
Yeah. Great question. So faith, and I don't mean by faith just like trying to imagine something, because sometimes we talk about you just need to, take it on faith. That's not what I mean. Faith is in the Christian sense means that God has told me something, and he's told us something because he's told us about his son. And sorry, I'm tapping my Bible, it's just down here. He's told us about his son. He's told us about what his son has done for us on the cross. And then the condition of how do I get that? How do I access all of that? How do I live forever with him? How do I get forgiven for all of this? How do I go from wherever I am now to 25 trillion years in the future, and I had a better day than I had the day before, and it will never stop? How do I get that? And that's where I'm going to use again that word faith, which is basically you put your faith in someone else. So take a really crude example. I like cycling. Say I'm stuck at the side of the road and I don't know how to change my tire. I don't know. This is the best example I can come up with right now. And I don't know how to change my tire because I've got a bad puncture. And another cyclist stops next to me and says, "Let me do that. I'll fix that for you because I know what I'm doing." And I say, "Yes, please, that'd be great." What I've done there is I've put my faith in that other person to be able to do something for me, because they've said they can do it and they've said they will do it. And I believe what they've said. And so I just trust them to do it. It's trust, basically. So that's the same way this works. There's nothing for you to do. And that's the great news about it. Going back to that thief on the cross, he didn't have time to do anything. He literally, I won't say he's on his deathbed. He's been crucified. He had no time to do any good stuff, to, give this much to charity, to help these many people. These are all things that Christians do, all this good works, but they're not something you do to gain God. You do them because you've already got him. And therefore, all this stuff just becomes something you want to do, not because you're compelled to do it. So, you basically just trust Jesus. And that's what I can say to everybody listening to the podcast right now, is that he offers you the chance to be with him forever. He offers you himself, because there's nothing he can give you that's better than himself. Because if he's God, he's eternal. He's never ending. He's more joyful than we can possibly, all that happiness he has, he offers that to you. And the only condition, the only thing anyone needs to do to get that is just to say, "Jesus, you said that you'll accept me. You did what I needed you to do on the cross for me. And I trust you. I trust you that when you say, if I come to you, you'll accept me." And Jesus' promise is 100% to everyone is, I will. I will. Yeah. John 6:37 is my favorite verse in the whole Bible, I think, which is basically it's all that the Father gives me will come to me. So all the people that God gives to me will come to me. And whoever comes, this is the one I love. This is the verse. Whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. I will never drive away. So no matter who you are, there's a promise. There's a promise from Jesus spoken to you. Whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. So if you want to come to him now, you don't need to do anything. You just come to him and say, "I trust you," because you said. And if you do that at this very moment, you'll be saved, and all these things will go from you onto him, and he'll give you his stuff instead, which is perfect, and he's yours forever. Yeah. Faith. Not works. Faith. Trust. It's just trusting him. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. I mean, me, for example, excuse excuse me, I haven't been a good person all the way through my life. In fact, I would have been crucified. I know I would have been crucified. My life took me into very dark places. And I was healed. I mean, you know some of my story.
Yeah.
My listeners know a lot of my story. For those that don't, I found myself 26th of June 2014. I was a homeless addict, and I found myself sat in a crack house at 10 o'clock at night, praying for freedom or death. I didn't even know if God existed, and I said, God, if you take this away from me, I'll be better. And I fell asleep, and I woke up, and I haven't used the day since. I was miraculously healed. I tried my whole life to get rid of that. However, I didn't want to take Jesus into my life because I still wanted the option to be a bit naughty. So does becoming a Christian mean that you can't sin? You can't?
No. So when you become a Christian, earlier we spoke about Jesus has like that dual nature. He's fully God and fully man in that sense. If we use similar language to that, you can say that in the Christian there's the new man or the new woman, so that you've been saved, you've trusted Jesus. There's now something of God in you. It says the Spirit now lives in you. The Holy Spirit lives in you, and you've got a new nature that wants God. You want him, because you realize that there's so much joy in him and it can be mine, and I love him, and you want him. So you have that nature, but you still have the old man or the old woman still living in you as well. If I could put them together, I don't know, maybe I could do something like that. Or if I could say, if you've got a throne, pretend you've got a throne inside you. The new person sits on the throne, but the old person still is wandering around that room, basically. So you'll find that it's like sometimes it can feel like a battle. Sometimes you'll be really like, part of you will really want to do something you shouldn't do. And you'll notice there's a war going on, because you'll have another nature, the new nature, saying, I don't want that anymore. I want him. I want him. And for some Christians, maybe the line of they got saved here and this is the end of, this is heaven, their line will probably be nice like that, as they seem to sin less and enjoy God more. For a lot of us, I'll put myself in that one, sometimes it can look much more like that, but the thing that the new nature does is, as I say, it's a war. It's like there's a battle going on inside you. And because that new nature that God has given you is the one that sits on that throne, like we said, on your heart, that's the one that if you put a trajectory on it, that's the one that's going to win. But at individual moments, you might be all the way up here or you might be all the way down here. But when it's tracked over the course of your life, you'll notice that actually, Jesus is changing me. He's making me into something new that I didn't think I could be. Yeah. So you will sadly still find yourself sinning and needing to go to God and say, I'm sorry. But it's different this time. You're not going to him as someone who doesn't know him. You're going to him as your father. You're going to someone who loves you intimately, and it's that different kind of sorry. If your kid comes to you and says sorry for doing something about the house, at no point have they stopped being your kid. At no point have you wanted to, disown them. It's a different kind of place that you're coming from. So you will still get sins in your life, but the thing that God does to you is he makes you not like sin. So it's not like some people often say to me, like after I became a Christian, like, well, does that mean you don't like having fun anymore? And I was like, well, no, I still have a lot of fun in my life. But some of the things, not all, some of the things I used to find fun, I don't anymore. It's not like I have this, I know I've used the phrases like battle and stuff, but you have, if I change the word to war, you win different battles over time. So things that used to be a real battle for me have become less of a battle now, because I'm not saying they can't come back, but you see victories as you go through, and your desires change. Things that you used to want, you don't want anymore. You want something better instead. So it's that kind of. I hope that language is coming through all right. It's God changes what you want. He changes your desires, basically. Yeah. And as I say, the trend line might look like this, but if you were to look over 10 years of your life, you'll notice like it's done that. Yeah. I'm not saying in year 11 you might not do that, but then in the 20 years after that you'll do this. But yeah.
I mean, look, I've been a Christian for 9 years. 9 years this week.
Amazing.
Well, actually, it would have kicked off 9 years ago this week.
Yeah.
I was in hospital, and I passed away for a little while. And I had my whole spiritual battle, and our mutual friend Grantley Watkins came in to pray for my soul, because they were told they would lose me again. And I had a spiritual battle, and I met Jesus at the end of my bed, and I knew what I had to do. And I've had people since say, well, we know who you were, and a leopard can't change its spots. And, I guess you've got these doubters, like doubting Thomas. And the sort of analogy I use is, well, no, a leopard can't change its spots, because that is a physical thing, but you can tame it to a certain level. You can train it. I don't have the same priorities as I did when I was a villain. I don't have the same violence. That level.
Your story is absolutely amazing to me, in all honesty, because I can see change in my life too. But the yours is just so dramatic, But in both of us, the same thing has happened. But and it, like going to your point about the listener, can they change their spots, etc. We've mentioned Paul a few times in this, haven't we? The Apostle Paul, like some of your listeners might know, but he started his career, so to speak, killing Christians and putting them in jail. That was his thing. He was a really zealous young man who despised Jesus and despised the Christians, and he was there when some of them were killed. He then was terrorizing the rest of the church, throwing them all in prison, like destroying lives and livelihoods, all that kind of stuff. His life was utterly and completely transformed, and he became one of the, if not the most famous Christian of all time. So in terms of can people change, can the leopard change his spots? I know what you like. Amen. Yes, they can. I know what you mean. That there'll be these like traces of who we once were and stuff like that. But can the direction of our life be changed, that we now want God more than we want those things? The answer is amen and yes. Yeah, exactly. You're not made perfect as a Christian yet. No. One day, after we die and we enter heaven, God makes us perfect completely. But for now, Christians ain't perfect. No. They're just people who have found something else that they love more than the things they once did. Yeah, and the thing that really sort of amazes me is that it doesn't. I get that my story is in parts miraculous and hard to believe for some. I get that it's this big thing that happened, and I use it to educate and to evangelize and things. But that doesn't make it any different to someone that comes to Christ in a more gentle way. You don't have to have had this difficult life. I didn't go through that. I didn't go through a difficult life in that sense. No. So you're completely 100%. I had a very lovely life. Wonderful family and wonderful upbringing. Jesus meets you where you are and takes you from there. You don't have to be a certain degree of goodness. You also don't have to be a certain degree of badness. It's just you just have to come from wherever you are to him. That's the part that's universal. Not how you were before, but yeah, how it is after. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Church. One of my favorite sayings is, "Church isn't a gallery for good people.
No,
It's
no,
a
no.
hospital for broken people."
Oh, amen.
And
Yeah,
we were so broken.
yeah.
And he does. He changes us in so many ways. He fixes us. He mends us, and he mends us in such a different way that you don't recognise like what we were. He puts us back together, but differently.
Yeah.
And I absolutely love that.
Me too, my friend.
I am aware of time, mate.
Yeah, no. Shall we wrap up with some prayer then, or anything
Yeah.
else?
So, if you would just sort of lead us in a prayer,
Of course I can.
for anybody that's listening or watching this
Yeah.
video too, anybody that's seeing this that might want to take it one step further.
Yeah. Go for it. Oh, all right. Lord, I thank you for this time, and thank you for getting to just talk about you. I thank you that time running away with us, Lord, but there's so much to say about you, and I feel like we could talk for another week and still have things to say. But yeah, so I just thank you for this time, and I pray for any listener, and I invite any listener now who wants to just join in with this prayer. And before I do that, I just read that little verse again from Jesus, which is that all that my Father gives me will come to me. And this is the part, listen to this, whoever you are. Whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. So if you are a whoever, please come, and you are invited to come. I once heard a very, very famous Christian say that the word whoever there is better than if it was actually your name written. Because if it was your name written, you'd worry that somebody else had the same name and they'd been invited and not you. Whoever comes. So, yeah, we just pray now. If this is you and you're a whoever and you want to come, I just invite you to just pray with me that, yeah, Lord, just accept this person. And we know that you will, because you promise it. Whoever comes to you, you will never cast away. And so whoever we are, we just come to you. And we say, I trust that, Jesus. I trust you. I trust you. And I know that I am yours because you say so. So I just thank you, Lord. I thank you for people listening to this who might be praying. I thank you for who you are. And I thank you that for thousands upon thousands of years, you've been working and bringing people to know you, to live with you forever. Amen.
Amen.